what you want, what you need. Can I be your savior? Everything's gonna crash and break, but I know, yeah I know, what you got, what you want, what you need. Gonna be your savior. Everything's gonna crash and break, your savior. It's time to redefine your deophobic mind. Don't hesitate, no escape from secrets on the inside. There's nothing left to lose. There's nothing left to prove. Surrender your love, it's all you can.
All right, well, we have an interesting topic this week. This, again, I see I caught their week. The week thing came out again this month.
Actually, it is this week yet. We're doing this.
That's true, yeah. So anyway, we done a little studying on what we're going to cover this week, month. Didn't get that right yet. We're going to go through Young and Old Earth today, or Old and Young Earth, however you want to phrase that. But Jay asked me an interesting question, and this is important to start off with. All of you that came to faith because you read Genesis 1 and believed the earth was young or old, raise your hand. That's important to remember as we go through this, because it's not a salvation issue. It's not. It's something interesting to think about and talk about, the different ideas that come into play. And when we get home, we'll know exactly the truth. And until then, we're a bit of a guessing game. Some of the stuff is pretty straightforward. Some of it is, the salvation message is very simple, very direct. But some of the other stuff is open for discussion. And that's what we'd like to do today, is to talk about this issue that is, it's pretty popular issue to talk about. Young and Old Earth, there's gentlemanly talk, calm talk about it. And then there's some talk that's not so calm. People get pretty distressed about this, and to be honest, when I first came to faith, I was one of those. I was pretty distressed about it. I had my doubts about anybody who didn't believe the earth was young. I'm a young earther. But since then, I've listened to different people. I came to respect some people, such as our pastors here, also Stephen Meyer, John Lennox,
Hugh Ross,
some other people that have different opinions, and they come to that opinion because they love Jesus. So about four or 5 years into that, I said, this is not the most important thing. So let's move on from being that direct. But I have my opinion on what it is, but if it turns out that it's not right, it's not going to affect me getting to heaven. Jesus is not going to stand there and say, well, Kelly, you understand that the earth is however many years old. He's not going to ask me that, nor is God. So,
and it's not going to change the fact that the truth is God made the earth.
Yeah. Either way, God made him. When he made him, isn't the big deal? Yeah. It's a good point, John, because the real big thing is that whenever you think it was, whether it was 13.5 billion years ago, or whether it was 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, it was still began. And the same aspects that come into a beginning come into play. There's a causal agent. Anything that begins to exist has a cause. The earth began to exist, regardless of when you think that might be. The earth began to exist, therefore the earth has a cause, a sufficient causal agent for it being here. So that's the main thing to keep in mind, I think, that is the case.
well, yes, it's created.
It is created, yeah.
When it was created is secondary to the fact that it was created.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that for the longest time, from Greek philosophers on down to pretty much the 1960s, the scientific community held to this indefinite time, that there was no beginning, and it
Right.
really took the likes of Albert Einstein, etc., to come up with this entire Big Bang theory that, of course, now creationists go against. But the point is that there was a resistance in the scientific community to the universe as having a beginning, because that got to the point you just made, which is that means there must be a cause outside of time and space.
Yeah. I mean, Fred Hoyle just about lost his mind over the fact that the universe was expanding, and that means that it used to be closer. Fred Hoyle went down that road for a while, and he just about lost his mind over it. Him and Einstein both, because they made predictions that was based on the Earth and the universe always being here, and they ran into the fact that that isn't really calculating very well, and they were not happy about that one little bit. Fred Hoyle said, you know, it appears to be this way, but it just appears that way, and I think it's still static state. He finally came to the conclusion, after he's noticed that the design of the universe, the particular settings of each one, we covered some of this before, but it's interesting. The particular settings of the universe, exactly where they're dialed in at to make it so life could exist. He finally came to the conclusion, and his quote was, "It is quite obvious that a superintelligence is monkeying with the settings." And he finally came to the point where he believed in God. And but like you said, it was until the 60s and Hawking and Penrose actually finally made this statement, and I think it was it irritated both of them quite a bit, that time, space, matter, and energy all had a beginning. Now, where else do we hear that? Where else do we hear that very same thing? Genesis 1.
Right.
In the beginning, time, God created the heavens, space, created the earth, matter, and a little later he said, let there be light, energy. So they said the same thing that Genesis said 1. It just took them around 1900 or so years to come to that conclusion. Anyway, let's start on what we would. First thing, let's like what Jay brought up, and I'm going to let you go through that, about the move thing that Lennox was talking about.
Right. I thought it was important to bring some historical context to the young Earth, old Earth debate, because in the 1600s there was another debate, and that debate was the fact that starting with Copernicus and then Galileo, that the Earth moved. The Earth is in an orbit around the sun, that the sun doesn't orbit around the Earth, as had been thought by Aristotle, that in fact it's the Earth that moves around. And the conundrum in the primary verse, there's others, but the primary is this Psalm 104:5, which says, speaking of God, "You who laid the foundations of the earth so that it should not be moved forever." And so the questions then for the theologian, but let me back up a second before we get to that. Later, you have Johann Kepler, who is tracking these orbits, and he was the one that came up with the elliptical orbit as opposed to a circular orbit. He was a believer. You've got Sir Isaac Newton, who's making his calculations. So they were not thrown off, and they were believers. And in the Principia Principia Mathematica that Newton wrote, he's talking about all the math and the science, but in the middle of it, he's glorifying the Creator. So he was not thrown off. So then the questions then for the theologians are, when is a literal interpretation of a verse like Psalm 104:5 to be taken as a literal fact versus a metaphor? Or maybe more to the point, how do we parse words such as move? And so I think that when a modern person, I'm sure we all understand that the Earth does orbit the sun. I don't think that's a disputed science. And it spins. And it rotates, and so we don't have a dispute there. But what is move in that context? Well, in my mind, move means it's not being moved off of its orbit.
Yeah, and it's a way of putting that is you could particularly, a certain person and maybe their political views, they're immovable in those. That's just a way of saying it. It's just a vernacular that you could use. Same with, Jesus said, "I am the door." Now, if you took that literally, then, you know, there's Jesus, right, standing over there as a door. It's a figurative way of speech. The same with, you know, if you had enough faith, you could move mountains. That's a vernacular of the time, saying that, you know, there's astounding things that you can do if you have enough faith. So there's reasons when things are spoken, and this was a verse like what you said. It was I think it was Catholic Church that took it that way, that the earth was stationary. And I think if all you had to do is just look up in the morning, see the sun cross over the sky, something's moving. So yeah, that was an interesting topic. That I mean, that's a good start at that with that, because that's important to remember, that we have to try to gauge what the book's actually saying, because we believe the Bible, but it does have figurative language in it, and a lot of it is in the Psalms. They're figurative.
Right.
So
then we've got, and I don't know if we want to get into this radiometric dating. We could leave that, I suppose, other than to say that one of the things that does come up with in this debate of young Earth versus old Earth is radiometric dating, carbon dating, which I did not put in here, but there's problems with both of those methods. And one of the things that tends to throw off, I believe, any sort of measuring of time like this is the flood and the pre-flood world. Because the pre-flood world, there was no rain, there was this covering, this envelope. That's going to affect things. And then, of course, the flood is the way that covered up rock and moved rock and affected the animals, etc. So, you know, we accept the truth of a global worldwide flood that covered all of the mountains. And if
it mixed up the deposits that are there with the animals that are there. It mixed it up. It's not, that idea is the uniformitarian view, where everything's been going on the same way all the way back, and all we have to do is look at that and we find what truth is. Rather, I think the people that are biblical believers would fall into catastrophism.
Correct.
We believe there's been events that really shook things up. And we just saw one in LA. That shook things up. Now, that's not global, but when you consider a global flood, which we're quite sure that the Bible describes a global flood. It says it's 19 cubits above the highest mountain. But that would shake things up. That would make it so the things that you expect to find have not been consistent. There's been an event that really damaged things completely. Water shooting up from below, depositing things that they're not expecting to deposit. And the fact that there's carbon-14, there's carbon-14 in the oil, carbon deposits. There's carbon-14 in oil deposits. There's carbon-14 in diamonds. And diamonds are supposed to be millions or billions of years old.
Dinosaurs.
Fossils have found carbon-14 in them. Those are things that should not be there. Carbon-14, some people say as long as a million years. I don't even think that many people think it's not even 50,000.
Yeah, I've heard 100,000.
100,000.
But way before dinosaurs.
Way before dinosaurs. So those dinosaurs should not have any carbon-14 left.
And I should say that way before dinosaurs, including to the uniformitarianism secular view.
Yeah.
Not according to scientists who have a creationist worldview.
Right.
And that really gets into when we start looking at this James Webb thing, or any science, you know, the data is the data.
Yeah.
The thing that needs to be made clear if we're explaining something to someone who wants to understand science and the Bible, the scientists who are Christians or creationists, they're not throwing out the science. Rather, they're looking at the same scientific data and coming to different conclusions based upon a worldview. And what is fascinating to me is that secular science has to ignore so much. For example, if you go on to the National Park Service website, they even talk about the fact that the rock layers do not correspond with this uniformitarian viewpoint. And their thing is, well, it's like ripping pages out of a diary. We can't explain it. No, what you're doing is your data ignoring. Okay? Or that petrified wood could occur over millions of years when we all know in common knowledge that when a tree falls, it decays.
It decays.
Versus if you've got a creationist viewpoint, you understand that when the earth opened up for the flood, you've got a bunch of hydrochloric acid coming out with minerals, and it shock mineralized the trees. And in fact, I found a study where people in the lab were able to shock metamorphize like a plant material, a tree material, and instantaneously mineralize it. That's a lot more of a rational, scientific explanation for the petrified forest in Holbrook, okay, than these trees fell down in place. Go out there and look. They're where they fell. And supposedly they didn't move for hundreds of millions of years. They didn't decay.
Right.
I mean, that's just pure folly.
And then they call them the trees that are standing straight up in the fossil record, going through millions of years of deterioration, and this tree never deteriorated, standing straight up in the different layers. I can't remember what they call that, but that's basically what the explanation is. And this tree, they say that this tree is standing there all this time, never fell over, never rotted, never did any of those things. Along with the layers that they have in the Grand Canyon, you don't see any deterioration in the layers. They're perfect layers. They're straight lines. There's no deterioration in them. And supposedly there was no geographic changes, rivers flowing, nothing through these layers. And they're not there. The simple layers aren't there. They're stacked. And they're perfectly horizontal with lines on them. Now, you can come up with whatever excuse you want, but it seems to me that those are laid down by water. And the different layers are because the water came in, deposited something, drew back out, came back in, deposited more, and they're just sifting down and sitting on straight layers.
Yeah, back to your catastrophism, right? That it catastrophically, a bunch of silt and everything came in there and buried a tree that was upright.
Yeah.
That's way more logical
Yeah.
than a tree could stand in there and take successive layers
And still stand.
and still stand.
Yeah. That's a darn strong tree.
Right.
Standing up through those floods.
So my point then is that when we get to the James Webb Telescope, you've got secularists holding to a Big Bang non-creationist viewpoint versus what the creationists
What's they're seeing.
are saying. And so I don't know, maybe that's a good segue into
Yeah, sure. So some interesting stuff I learned about the James Webb Telescope when we started doing this. The James Webb Telescope is way out beyond, I think beyond the moon is where it orbits at. It's not close to the Earth, like the Hubble is. They were talking about that. You saw the video that I saw. The link is on your papers too. You can watch that. But the Hubble telescope is close. They can go up in the space shuttle. They can send an astronaut over to fix it because it didn't work very well at first. But they sent some astronauts up to fix it. The James Webb Telescope's not like that. It's farther out. It's further out than we've sent any humans so far, beyond the moon. And it had to work perfectly when it got there. There was no way to go out and fix it. So luckily it was $11 billion instrument, something in that
very
range.
huge.
Yeah. And if it hadn't worked, they wouldn't be able to fix it. Just interesting point there. But what's happened with the James Webb Telescope, it looks beyond what the Hubble can look at. The James Webb Telescope looks into, and I don't really understand this very well, so I'll just throw it out there, and if you guys want to look it up. It's looking into the side of the infrared, that the same thing that Hubble does, but it looks at a further distance. It looks at stuff that we can't see. Because these things are so redshifted that they actually disappear to our eyes. We can't see them. There's a range of light that we can't see. And it's on both sides. But on the red side, it's so far away and so distant, moving at such a rapid speed that we can't see it, at least not with our eyes. And the Hubble telescopes can't see that either, but the James Webb can. And it was a shock to astronomers what the James Webb telescope has seen. Out at the distant ends of the galaxy, this is just, I don't want to get into this too far because it's kind of wonky. But what this whole thing is if the Big Bang is true, then the universe started at a certain point. And the further away those galaxies are, the older they should be. And they should be in a condition where they're starting to deteriorate. They're not having the type of elements that we're seeing in them because they're so far away and so old. But the James Webb Telescope is not reporting that. The James Webb Telescope is reporting that these galaxies that are out 14 billion light years away, and that's beyond how we think the age is right now, because that's starting to rethink the Big Bang. But these things are so far away, but they're not expecting to see what they're seeing. These galaxies are fully formed galaxies, and they should be in infant stages, baby galaxies. They should be barely forming. But as James Webb looks at them, they're completely formed, well-designed galaxies that have heavy elements in them. That is not what they expected to see at all. And what it does, though, is brings to mind what we as believers think that God created the universe. And that's what he says throughout the biblical text, is he created it. And it seems to me that it's, even if you believe there's a gap between Genesis 1 and 2, let's assume that that's there or not there. But even if you think that way, God does say he created the heavens on the fourth day. The moon, the sun, and all the stars on the fourth day. So if that's the case, it's not doing the evolution thing, because there's evolution here and there's evolution in space too. They use the same idea that it came together by itself. It kind of coalesced.
Well, yes, but they play off one another. Once the astronomers picked up on the uniformitarianism viewpoint that there was all this time going by, well, then how much time? And so then when they go from the Big Bang, then they're coming back to, well, these rock layers even longer. And so they keep kind of going back and forth and at the same time extending out to where we get to something like 14.6 billion years would be a secularist view. So that before the actual operation of the James Webb Telescope, and everybody said, okay, this thing's going to go up, this is what we expect it to do, this is kind of what we expect it to see, predictions were made.
Yeah.
And the secularist scientists made one set of predictions. The creationists that are young earthers, and this is important distinction now, nuance, the young earth creationists made another set of predictions, but the old earth creationists, notably Hugh Ross, in his book, The Creator and the Cosmos, he was similarly where the secularists were, meaning that not fully formed and not having heavy elements.
Right.
Because what the natural sort of viewpoint on elements is that stars, when they explode, will throw off things that stars don't typically have. Stars typically have hydrogen and helium mainly, and some lithium.
Light elements.
Light elements. They do not have even oxygen, which is a heavy, or nitrogen, which or carbon, any of these heavier elements, uranium, any of these, gold, any of these things. And so it would take all of these billions of years with exploding stars, and somehow the Earth has got stuff buried in it like this, which is, I find hard to fathom. But be that as it may, the creationists that are the young Earth proponents, their prediction was, well, look, because God created it just within a few thousand years, no matter how far you go out, you are going to find fully formed galaxies. You are going to find heavy elements.
Yep.
And we know who's right?
That's what the James Webb has seen. James Webb has seen further out you go, it doesn't change. There's fully formed galaxies that look young and in close, and there's fully formed galaxies that look young outside. They're all there. And that's the problem. That's not what they expected to have. And There people that still believe the Big Bang is going on. And me personally, I've always thought the Big Bang had one interesting concept to it. The fact that it did have a beginning. And I use that all the time when I talk to people that don't believe. So, well, you know, I don't necessarily agree with everything the Big Bang says, but what I do believe is it had a beginning. And that's the state of the Big Bang. And I don't think that James Webb is disturbing that. The fact that it had a beginning. It's disturbing what the suppositions are after that. How they said that the Earth, how planets form, how stars form, how galaxies form, how all that stuff's supposed to work. James Webb's telescope is saying, maybe not. Maybe that's not how they form. Because it doesn't appear to be that way when we get out so distant where the James Webb can look. It can look way past where the Hubble can look, and way clearer as well.
And if I can, just to kind of make this a little clearer, is that if there was a point from the beginning, what they call a singularity, and these things are expanding out, James Webb can look so far out that if you go back to this uniformitarianism viewpoint, it would take all of these billion years at the rate of expansion to get out that far.
Right, and it's looking not only I want to talk about the time thing, but according to their suppositions, this is not only looking back on distance, it's looking back on time as well. Supposedly what the James Webb is looking at is where the universe first began. Maybe, according to them, maybe 3 or 4 million years or maybe 1 billion years after the universe began. And there shouldn't be these galaxies formed because they take too long to form. Supposedly the stars form first, and the stars collide with, get in gravitational pulls from other stars, and they start creating what may be a small galaxy. The galaxies run into each other. They gather stars more, become more stable. That's what they're saying should happen. But when they look, they don't see that. They're not seeing it. Now, let me talk about light travel for a second, because this is an interesting topic to me. I've always liked this. So, young Earth creationists believe that when you're looking at a star and they're talking about that star, they're saying it's a certain distance. We agree. It is a certain distance. But that doesn't relate to how old it is. Because as anyone that's in physics that has a master's degree in physics or a PhD will tell you that the one-way speed of light cannot be measured. Einstein said that, Hubble said that. All of them say it, that can't be measured because there's no way to measure it. Trying to synchronize the clocks, you lost it right there. Because the clocks cannot be synchronized even if they're a couple feet apart. Because the lower gravity is, the faster a clock will run. And that's where the problem is. They can measure the two-way speed of light, and they can do that, and it's fine. But when they start talking about distant stars, light traveling to us, taking a certain time frame, there's nothing in physics that says that that's the case. And if you say that the light arrives here instantly, you're not violating any physics laws. So that's the biggest argument. To me, that's the biggest argument that the universe is old. And it could be. I'm not saying it's not. It's either way, Jesus is not going to keep me out of heaven because I believe one way or another. But to me, that's a way that the biggest problem that the young Earth people have, like myself, is that that starlight, it is that distant. Most cosmologists believe that, even the young Earth people believe it, that those stars really are that distance out, 14 billion light years out. But what the difference is that the young Earth people think, well, if you can't measure the one-way speed of light, there's nothing that says it can't be instant. Meaning that we're looking at things right now as they're happening right now, even that far out. There's a guy by the name of Jason Lyell. He's a young Earth creationist, but he's a PhD from, I think it's MIT, and he's an astrophysicist. And these are things that he's looked up. I think it's on the handout. There
is a video from him. It's the second James Webb telescope's entry. It says James Webb telescope confirms earlier creationist predictions.
Yeah.
And that's Jason Lyell.
Yeah. So you guys can watch that. It's on YouTube. He's got a few of them on there. He's cracks a few jokes along the way. So he's an interesting guy to listen to. But that's where I arrive at the young Earth thing. But tell me where. mean, because there's two different ideas at it, and the pastors here at church, they believe a different thing than that, but they're open to it. They're open to say, well, could be.
Right. I think that the concern is that back to the foundations of the earth,
Yes.
and the earth shall not be moved, but we know the earth orbits.
Yes.
What if science moves to a point where it's conclusive, so to speak, that it's an old earth? That doesn't seem to be the way the science is going, and the James Webb Telescope is, exhibit A in this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if we wanted to move to the biblical context, to me, the best argument, really as a believer, based on the Bible, is the theological argument that on day 6, when God said it is very good, that if all this was extended out and you've got animals and land animals and fish and birds, and there was all this time that evolutionists are saying, or maybe these theistic evolutionists, the problem with that concept theologically is, how could on day 6 God call it very good?
Right, when there's
Right.
disease and all the rest.
Right, so we got into this thing about the definition of what yom is, and we've got that on page 2 of the handout. Yom can be a literal day, which of course young earthers believe. Yom could be another period of
Time frame too.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so when you've got pastors, for example, that are a little gun shy about taking a firm position on that, they understand that yom, the word translated as day, does have this variable meaning. But again, where you've got people like Ken Ham with Answers in Genesis making a very, I think, convincing argument that, look, if the word yom for all these days is billions of years, then we had a lot of death, and death did not enter until after the fall.
Right.
When you could no longer say it was very good, because death isn't very good.
Yeah, exactly. There's animals eating other animals, animals eating humans, and all this stuff going on. And that would not be what God would call very good. Disease, cancer, all the rest of it. But he said to Adam that they weren't going to die. When it comes to the Genesis 1 is a general description of him creating the universe. And when Genesis 2 rolls along, it's not a different Genesis, it's not a different account. All it is God's focusing in on humans. Because the rest of the book's all about humanity, right? It's all about humanity. So some people will tell you there's 2 different creation accounts. There's not. Genesis 2 is just focusing in on humans. But what he tells Adam is that, he has him name all the animals, and he tells Adam that the entire garden is free for you to eat. But there's one thing that you cannot eat, otherwise you will die. Now, why did he say that? Because if you don't do it, you're not going to die. So there was no death when God created the earth, and he put them in the Garden of Eden. There was no death. And he gave Adam a free choice, and unfortunately we're all dealing with that free choice now. But when they sinned, that's when problems came along. And if Adam really is the first human, and I want to talk about that in a minute, how long humans have been here, because I think that's a pretty straightforward fact that they have not been here very long, but I'll get to that. But when that happened, that's when all the problems started carrying on, because God said, okay, you're a sinner now. I'm not having you live the rest of your life as a sinner. You're out. I gave you this place. I told you not to do what you did, and you could stay here. And we were going to have a perfect environment. But as I would have done as well, as soon as somebody tells me not to do something, when I walk by a chair and it says wet paint on it, the very first thing I do is touch it to make sure they're telling me the truth. So Adam did the same thing, and I'm not saying I wouldn't have done the same thing either. This fruit, apparently, I don't think it was an apple. Whatever the fruit was, it looked nice, and it enticed Adam and Eve. Ladies, she was the one that took the first bite. We'll leave that alone, though. That's when everything went sideways, Because now God doesn't have the perfect environment that he told them to do. And the reason why he put that fruit there, he gave them a choice. But if they didn't have that fruit there, then they wouldn't have a choice. Then it doesn't matter if they have a freedom of choice. They didn't get anything to choose that's wrong. So God let them have that. And he told them, don't do it, or else this is going to happen. So when we get into Genesis, there's something that I think comes up, and then we can move on to something else. But I wanted to talk about this because it's been something I've been thinking about for a while. When you look around our environment, when you look around where we live in our society and in the environment globally, I don't see this age thing. I just don't see it. First of all, the population. That's my first spot I want to start at. The population now is about 8 billion. The first time it reached 1 billion was 1810. So in a little over 200 years, it grew 7 billion people. If you start from that 1810 and work backwards, the population keeps getting less, lower and lower population level of humans. That's just a given. It's the way it is. There's no dispute about that. The first time it reached 50 billion was the time about 1000 BC is when the population, according to the secularists, reached 50 million. The further back you go, the less population there is, until we get back to the first two. In the same place, at the same time, one blue one and one pink one. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sitting here. So the time frame on that, from if you just use the standard growth rate of 3.2%, the first two humans came around about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. And that's exactly what the Bible says. Now, based on that, you would expect to see that, for example, manuscripts, you would expect to see the first manuscript not any more than 3,000 or 4,000, maybe 5,000 years old. And that's exactly what we see. The Epic of Gilgamesh is somewhere around 4,000 to 5,000 years old. That's the first manuscript, the first writing that humans ever did, that we've ever found. So when they talk about these humans being around for 200,000, 300,000 years, 400,000, all the way up to 1 million, so tell me something, why didn't they write anything down? Why didn't they ever make any manuscript whatsoever on what their actions were? Why didn't they do that? I don't think it's because they couldn't write. I think it's because they just weren't there that early. Humans have only been around for a short period of time. All of our technology, everything that we have, from the original boats that were sailing ships that they had to hug the coast because they weren't too sure about how things were going, up to the point now where we have, boats, cruise ships that can sail around the world. Those are things that happen only in 4,000 to 5,000 years of time, less than 10,000. The fact that no Europeans have ever gotten to the Americas, except for 15,000 to 1,500 years ago, depending on which one you look at that got here first. There was 200,000 or 300,000 years of time where they never ventured across the ocean. And societies, there's no designation of societies before that, again, because of manuscript. No wars that they've named out the generals that fought in them. All these things point to me that the humans have not been around here very long. And that's exactly what Genesis talks about. Humans have been here a very short time, comparatively. If somebody tries to tell you they've been around for 200 or 300,000 years, okay, well, how come they didn't write anything down? They never wrote a single piece of document with some sort of language that we understand. There's none at all, but even with that, even if they would have written in Egyptian, which we took a long time to figure out what that was, but we knew somebody wrote it because it's language, it's depictions that we figured, we had no idea what they were talking about until we found the Rosetta Stone. But we knew it was there, and we just don't see that. So in my mind, humans have only been around for a very short time, and like I said, the first two, if you use the standard growth rate of 3.2%, you get to the first two. In the same place, at the same time, one blue one and one pink one, or none of us would be here. If Adam was created 100 years before Eve, we got no babies.
Right.
Yeah. So,
And it would probably, I guess, go back, at least in terms of humanity, to Noah and his wife, right? So then you can add a period of time before that. But in terms of looking at population growth, you're talking about a specific point in time with 8 people,
Eight
right?
people. Yeah,
You've got Noah and his wife, their 3 sons and their wives.
right.
Were on the ark.
The wives were not of the same, you know, they came from different families. So we're
Right.
not having this problem with
So the point.
marrying too close into families, that type of issue.
Right, so every time you look at the biblical view of creation, the biblical view of humanity versus the secular views, the thing we always have to ask is, what would you expect to find? So if you're going to believe in the biblical account that Noah and sons and daughters-in-law, then humanity came from those people, what would you expect in terms of population, taking into account wars and disease and all the rest of this? And what you're saying is, this is what we would expect to see in terms of a population increase.
Right, and if you actually did have, the other thing that you can look at, if you actually did have humanity around for 200,000 or 300,000 years, we would have maybe enough space of maybe a mile around us. There would be so many people on the earth. Remember, 200 years, the population grew by 7 billion people. To justify anything like this nonsense of us being around for that long would be multiple extinction events. And we just don't see that. We see one extinction event, Noah. But we don't see any of the rest of them. There's evidence for the flood. There's saltwater fish bones in the highest mountains you can find. The layers of the fact that we have fossils at all. Fossils only form if they're buried quickly, like there would be in a flood. So those type of things are reasons why we can solve the problems that we have. I don't understand. I mean, the people that think that men have been around that long, what they say is there's multiple extinction events where humanity was almost wiped out, maybe down to just 1,000 people. But we don't see it. We don't have any record of it.
Right, we've got certain things like the Ice Age preserving people. We have obviously some human fossils, but you don't see it in the successive layers.
Yeah.
That you would expect to find if you had a secularist worldview.
If you had that worldview, yeah.
That's right.
And as far as the wording goes, there's something that's that was a Bob study just this last Monday, and he just happened to be in Jeremiah chapter 4, where this idea of this gap theory is spelled out. I don't agree with it, but it's not to say that it couldn't be. So, are you familiar with the gap theory enough to explain it?
Well, what I understand...
Because I'm really not. I'm not fully on it.
You know, I'm not really either, because it's not really important to my belief system, certainly. But the point is that there were certain gaps in the creation account that would, between successive creation, so between these days, again, day not being a literal day.
Yeah. In Genesis, the gap theory assumes that between Genesis 1, where God is describing the general creation, and Genesis 2, there's a period of time in between those, that there was a destruction. And it says that, you know, the earth was without form and void. Now, personally, I think there's two ways to look at that without form and void. Maybe it means there was a destruction. That's not the side I'm on, but okay. There was a period where the earth was and it got completely destroyed, and then God came in and put it back together again. Okay. But it could also mean without form and void could also mean that it's just in God the mind so far. That he's got it and it's like a designer. A designer has it in his mind first of what he wants. And I personally think that without form and void, all it's saying is that it just hasn't created yet. It's not pure yet, but it's coming.
Yeah, the Spirit hovered over the face of the waters,
yeah.
Right?
And that's another reason here God says that in Genesis, it talks about that, says the Spirit hovered over the face of the waters. And this is at the very beginning. But if you look at this thing, you know, down the road with this wonky stuff, with heavy elements, hydrogen is a light element. hydrogen, helium, and lithium, but oxygen is not. God said that oxygen was there right at the start. He hovered over the surface of the waters. That's a heavy element, and it was already there. That's it right at the beginning. So the Bible has it the way the James Webb Telescope is saying. Now the heavy elements are there. What you say is way out there. They're supposed to be at near the beginning. The heavy elements are already there. So we're kind of backtracking there a little bit, but I just wanted to get that part in.
Well, I think that what you're getting down to, if somebody isn't just trying to stiff-arm God, and if somebody is actually looking at all the evidence, because remember that to hold to the secularist viewpoint, you're having to continue to ignore data, just like the National Park Service putting on a website that it's like pages being ripped out of a diary. We don't understand these rock layers, rather than looking at what are all the possibilities and trying to take into account the evidence that's going against uniformitarianism.
Yeah.
That said, if somebody's looking at all of this, you have to come to the conclusion that there is a supernatural. Okay, we've talked about this, that you can't create something from nothing. There was a beginning. That was the big shocker. This is what upset atheists, because there had to be something supernatural, meaning outside of nature, that was this first cause. Okay, we now know another good example is DNA. The information in DNA could not come from inert minerals. It just couldn't. Information doesn't just come from nothing. Information has to come from a designing mind. A coder, a code needs a coder, period. Okay, so a scientist would have to say, look, I'm popping the white flag on the fact that there's got to be some degree of supernatural. The question then becomes, for a person who, again, is looking at all the data, where does the supernatural end and the natural begin? That's really more of the point.
Yeah. And it seems to me, the more closer that we look at it, the more science gets into the realm of where they're going right now, the more likely it is that God's right and the Bible is correct. This is just one of them. Let me read you a couple verses where, to me, it seems to be saying that even in the Bible, it says that people were around right at the start. Now, in my mind, Genesis says that. In my mind, those are days. 6 days. It says morning and evening. I've asked some Hebrew scholars, or Hebrew people that knew it pretty well, and they said, no, when it says morning and evening, that pretty much denotes a day, a regular day. It may have been 30 hours instead of 24, but either way, it's not millions of years. But let me read you a couple verses here that seem to me to say, even in the New Testament, for example, Mark 10:6, it says, but from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. And then Luke 1:70 says, as he spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets, who have been since the world began. I think the Bible is pretty clear saying the human beings were around at the very start. So did they have an uncle that was a monkey? I find nowhere, absolutely nowhere in the Bible where it says that. It's saying that humans were around from the very beginning. Not only that, but Genesis 2:4, this is the history, the generations of the heavens and the earth, when they were created in the day the Lord God made the heavens and the earth. Now that's one that where it says day, that's kind of a figure of speech, right? It says in the day that the Lord God made the heavens and the earth. That day thing then could be like the time frame. That's, I think,
Right.
where we're going with
And
that.
that's why we had that to compare Exodus 20:11. For in the 6 days the Lord made the heavens, and then rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. That would connote a literal day. Then in Genesis 2:4, the generations of the heavens and the earth, and in that day would be
day.
more metaphorically of the
Speaking
day.
of a time frame.
Correct.
Yeah. So that's where I think you can kind of translate those words like we were talking about when we very started, when they were saying, okay, this whole move thing, what does that really mean? And I think this day thing is the same. There's places in the Bible where it does say that. In that day, in Joseph's day, for example, the earth was frozen in place for him a while so he could kill some more enemies. It says in that day. It just means during Joseph's lifespan. Day just kind of denotes a time period. But I don't think it comes down to the point where we could say that the day part that's going on in Genesis, at least in my opinion, and I don't think the pastors here think that either. I believe that I've talked to Ed and Greg about it. They don't believe the humans have been around very long either. Now, they may think the Earth's been a little bit older, but as far as humans go, they believe humans have only been here a short time. And to me, there's important, because if in fact, let's assume that Adam is about what he says he is, because the genealogy says Adam is a certain age. If there really were humans around before that, let's say the 100,000 or 200,000 years, you have a question to ask. Are all these humans in hell because there was no salvation plan for them? Because the salvation plan came through Adam. He was the first Adam. The second Adam, the complete salvation came around the plan. But what about the people that were around before that? What about the people that are around that could not read any of Genesis? I don't believe they exist. That's another question to ask. And it was one that John Lennox was debating this guy called Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens is an interesting character. He's a very humorous guy. If you got away from listening to him rag on Christians, he's actually a funny guy to listen to. He's not an atheist anymore because he's dead. He stood in front of Jesus, so he's not an atheist anymore. But he had a debate with John Lennox, and John Lennox was wiping the floor with him like he usually does all atheists. But he came to a point where Christopher Hitchens asked a good question. He asked him, he said, okay, I get what you're saying, but tell me something. Why is it that God would allow all those people, let's say the humans have only been around 100,000 years, why would God create all those people and allow them to die without any chance of salvation because they were before Adam? Now, that's a darn good question. And personally, me saying that John Lennox needs to learn something, that's quite a stretch. But I would say that John didn't have a very good answer for that, because he allowed a position that the humans have been around for even that long to allow that to pass by. I personally don't think that's possible. I don't find the evidence for it. And we're all looking for evidence. Like Jay said, Christians have the same group of evidence that secular people have. We have the same stuff. We're looking at the same thing. We're just coming up with different conclusions based on that evidence.
Right, which I think leads me to the thing that I've been thinking about as we've been studying this topic, and that is when we're sharing with somebody, the issue here is, can I trust the Bible?
Right.
Can I believe the Bible? Do I believe that the Bible is the inspired Word of God? And that said, is it really Genesis 1 that should be the focus of that? I think if we're engaging with someone, I think the question needs to be asked to know where that person's coming from. Do they believe that the Bible is the inspired Word of God? If the answer is, I'm not sure, no, or I'm not sure, or I don't know, there are things about the Bible that we can certainly point to. We've covered some of the messianic prophecies.
Yes.
We can talk about the impossible probability that anybody could have fulfilled it other than Jesus. How could they know in advance? How could Daniel know about the rise and fall of the Greek Empire, for example? And there's a myriad of prophecies that have been fulfilled. Just simply reading the Gospels, for example, it's hard to come away with a view other than this didn't come from people. This is so counterintuitive in the entire plan of salvation that there are ways, I think, of comforting someone's mind that this truly is the inspired Word of God. And then once we do that, then we've got a better footing to analyze the scientific data.
Right.
I think one of the things that's come up now in current events is this whole thing with man-made, ultra-processed food.
Yes.
Jesus said, you're in the world, don't be of the world. And my take is, we need to be eating more natural foods. Let's not be too, of the world here when we're putting stuff in our mouths.
Listen to Mr. Kennedy. He may have a point.
But it should be shaping things like health.
Yeah.
Just the basic human condition.
God made things for a certain purpose, and we can use them for that purpose. Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. I think that pretty much covers what I was hoping to get at. I don't think we have enough time to go into any prophecy. I'm not going to be here next week, Dirk and Jay. Month. I may not be here next week either. You guys won't be either. Next month, I'm not going to be here. I'm going to be in Mexico. But Dirk and Jay are going to go through some stuff, and they'll get with
Well,
Jason.
Jay's gonna go through some stuff. I'm gonna sit there and go, yeah.
Okay. But any questions? Any questions you guys might have? Yeah, Daniel.
So I'll keep the questions limited because I could easily talk for another hour and a half, which I know we don't have time for. But I would mention, so there's basically 4 different creation accounts, or like 4 different creation models that exist. And I just wanted to briefly mention who tends to believe each of them, because sometimes that kind of helps us to understand it a little bit too. So the young earth creationism, like your literal 6 day, 6,000 years to 10,000 years ago, God made everything.
Right.
That tends to be your fundamentalist evangelical Protestants believe that. So
For the most part,
that's like
yeah.
your Southern Baptists, your evangelical, non-denominational, D.L. Moody, Billy Graham type of, like, that's the tendency. And I'm stereotyping, but that's the tendency. Gap theory, what I have noticed, it came out in the Schofield Bible, and there was kind of a generation that believed that. But in today's Christianity, who tends to believe the gap theory are Pentecostals. And the reason why that tends to be, from my experience, is because there's the idea of, well, what would be the judgment that God would have done before this current creation? And the judgment would have been the fall of Satan. And Pentecostals like to emphasize Satan in the spiritual battle.
Yeah.
And so they kind of find like a niche in the gap theory to help explain a lot of that. The day-age theory is more like you put in the long periods of time, but instead of it being a gap at the beginning, it's the actual days of creation. I've noticed that tends to be the view of more the liturgical churches.
More on the liberal side.
Somewhat.
Theistic evolution.
Well, theistic evolution and day age are slightly different. Day age is not really saying that there was ever an evolution between species. It's saying that there were different creation events that happened. Like each day is long periods of time, but you don't actually have Darwinian evolution.
Right.
And so that tends to be the belief I've noticed of like many Roman Catholics, many Lutherans, many Reformed Christians. They tend to believe that. And then theistic evolution, what that one is saying is, it's basically saying Genesis 1 is not to be taken literally. Because day agers are still trying to take it literally. They're just trying to say a day can mean something different.
Plugging in more time, and they've got their own set of troubles doing that. But
Right.
Because without, plants would need to be fertilized, at least some of them. And if you're going to go a couple million years between plants and bugs, you got a problem.
But a theistic evolutionist, what they're trying to say is the whole thing is not really literally true. There was evolution, and God used evolution to create things, and that tends to be your liberal. That tends to be like, because what that one is doing that the other 3 models are not doing is the other 3 models are still believing in a literal Adam and Eve, and that's how sin entered the world. And you can believe the Apostles' Creed, the basic statement of Christian faith, and hold either the day age, the gap, or the young earth creation. Theistic evolution is very difficult to hold the Apostles' Creed, because how do you have sin entering the world if you believe that there was not a literal Adam and Eve? Because theistic evolutionists don't believe in literal Adam and Eve.
Well, and the problem there too, which we've touched on earlier, is that mathematically evolution fails because there's not enough time for all the mutations.
Right.
And the Cambrian explosion, where all these fossils end up in a rock layer, you know.
Yeah, and there's no intermediate forms.
And there's not enough time for all of these to have occurred through mutation. So that's out.
I personally think that's the most damaging view that you can have of time is to take the theistic evolution, because to me, I just don't see where. To me, what in my mind, my picture of that is, why would I want to follow a designer that fails all the time and has to rework things on a regular basis to get them to work? And that's what evolution is. You have to have death, and you have to have this magic mutation thing to create everything. And I personally think that the theistic evolutionists just haven't looked at evolution very closely. I think they adopt it because maybe they've been through the school system, and they say, well, evolution's true, but I also believe in God, so I'm going to plug them together. I don't think they've looked at evolution very closely to see the major issues it has.
Scientifically, theologically,
major
the whole
issues.
thing.
Yeah, it doesn't
Agreed.
really agree with either side completely.
And I would
It
say
doesn't
too,
really have the science on their side, and it doesn't have theology on their side either. It's kind of like the Christian Science Monitor that Ed makes fun of all the time. It's not Christian and it's not science.
and I would say theistic evolution, it's definitely a position that a person could hold, but not really as a Christian. Like, let's say if you're a deist, if you believe in God, but you're not sure what revelation there is, or if there is a revelation, it's just a belief in an abstract God. Theistic evolution makes a lot of sense. That
But
God,
not scientifically.
but it does not scientifically make sense.
It will not hold up, and that's the thing that is not getting a lot of airplay. And even scientists who are not believers are agreeing, this is critical, that there isn't enough time, there never will be enough time for the 8.6 million species that are on the planet, let alone the ones that have already gone extinct. There's never enough time in the history of time, of any time, way past 14 billion years, where there's more zeros in that number than there are, particles in the universe. It's just, it's a number that you can't even calculate. It's so high.
It's beyond reasonable. It may be.
It's
you might be able-
impossible.
you maybe think it's possible. I personally don't. I don't think evolution is even possible. But let's assume that you say, well, it's possible. Like, Jay could be a man from Mars and only seeing the image here. Okay, that's possible. But do you have any proof for that?
It's possible, but it's not probable.
It's not probable at all. And as we started off with J. Warner Wallace, what he's aiming at is beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think when you look at things the way that the Bible portrays them, they're true beyond a reasonable doubt. From Genesis through Revelation, I believe it's beyond a reasonable doubt. The apostles running around telling this account that they followed Jesus around for 3 years, telling everybody what he did, and they were threatened with death in the most disturbing ways, but they wouldn't change their story. I just don't see how that could happen. That doesn't seem probable to me.
Well, back to this James Webb Telescope, this is now the cumulative evidence. See, and looking back and not data ignoring. If somebody's willing, and this is where it's a heart issue,
willing, yes.
right? Am I willing to seek God through science? Okay,
And
that's a
several that do.
legitimate thing to do as far as I'm concerned, and the science now is pointing that way. What we would expect to find as believers is what somebody should find if they are objectively looking at the data and not ignoring data.
Willing to look at it. Just
Willing to look at it.
Whatever it may conclude, I'm willing to look at it.
And so we would expect to find heavy elements out there. We would expect to find fully formed galaxies. We would expect that DNA would come from the mind of an intelligent being.
Mm-hmm. Super intelligent from what you see from his design of life. We haven't even come moderately close to what God designed. And yeah, I'm just beyond that. But anybody else? Question? Let me just make sure. Anybody else questions? Mr. Dirk, go.
A couple of, decades ago, I read an article about how the scientists were having some trouble, astronomers, because the light coming from the stars was actually older than the stars themselves.
Yeah.
In the redshift area, because they were using Doppler to measure that. Now, do you know if they've come up with any other way that they measure the age of the stars? Because they're saying they're this old, but how do they know that? They're
When the
saying
light's older than the
Doppler
star
method,
is, yeah.
with the redshift.
Mm-hmm.
What I've heard is they've worked it back from the Doppler theory. What I've heard, and this is getting outside of my wheelhouse, but what I've understood is that the Doppler mechanism for evaluating things has gotten confirmation, and that perhaps these stars aren't as old as they thought they were.
Then they still have the problem because the light coming from them is older than the stars.
Well, and here's the reason, because the understanding was that that the actual space of the universe is expanding.
Mhm.
And that way there would be a bending of the light that would affect the red shift. But if you accept the fact that the universe is expanding into pre-existing space, then it works out better mathematically, is how I understand it.
So that bending of the universe is causing the light to bend, so it's taking longer? Is that what you're?
It's affecting the red shift
The
in
shift
some
up.
way. That's what I understand.
Okay.
If you look at that, the link that we put on for Jason Lale, he goes into that.
Okay.
He goes into that part, and he's not real like dogmatic about this, but the stretching out of the actual space.
Mm-hmm.
He says if that was the case, then what would you expect to see, and why you would expect to see this? I have no idea because I'm not in my position. He said if that was actually happening, then the things that you looked at far distant out would actually appear to be larger than what they really are. And
Right.
that's not the case. When they look at things and when they see it through the James Webb Telescope, it actually shows the actual size of those galaxies, not bigger. So he came through a bunch of stuff, and when I talked to him, when I listen to him, I have to slow it down and say, okay, stop for a second, Jason. Let me catch what you're trying to say here, okay?
Well, the explanation I think is pretty simple, really. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. He said,
That's
let
it.
there be light.
And
Fourth day,
what God said about it is we agree with a bunch of it. For 2,300 years, like what we were talking about at first, for 2,300 years, most of the scientists, even some of the creationists, felt that the universe had always been here. And they had a good reason to think that. When they looked up in the sky at a certain time of the year, they would see the certain constellation, it was there. And they said, no, that's static, it's always been there, nothing's wrong with it, it's just always been here. Now I think there's reasons to think that's not true, but that's what science thought until 1929. When Hubble looked through the telescope and he saw that all the things in the universe were redshifted with very few exceptions, that means they're moving away from us.
Right, and this
it
is a
means
Bible,
expanding.
and this is a Bible confirming scientific discovery, because without a revelation from outside of time and space, if we were merely looking out at, back thousands of years ago and looking out, they would have agreed with the Greeks. Instead, we have a revelation from God. In the beginning, God created, that then becomes confirmed not that many years ago.
No,
I mean, you're talking only 100 years ago.
for
now.
2,300 years they felt one way, until somebody that they didn't have telescopes as powerful as what Hubble had. But he looked at it and he said, well, hold on a second here. That doesn't seem to be accurate. Things are moving away from us. If they're moving away from us, then if you run back in time, they used to be closer to us. And that's what he came up with, and it was a very evil thing in the eyes of most people at the time. They didn't like this. Einstein and Hoyle, they didn't like this one little bit. They argued with him. They actually came out, because he did it in San Diego with the telescope that's up on
No, Mount Wilson.
Mount Wilson.
It's in LA.
In LA, okay. Anyway, they came out here to look through the telescope, and they said, okay, well, he's right, but we don't like it.
Right, and it's not just in the beginning,
But also throughout
page 2, Isaiah, this 40:22, talks about God stretching out the heavens like a curtain.
Yeah,
And
and that's not the only place. It says it throughout. It's many places.
well, and
Psalms.
we have a curtain behind us, and if you stretch out a curtain like that with folds, okay, what happens is as you're stretching it out from yourself, it's unfolding faster as the farther it goes away, you see, and that's how the universe is expanding. The outer edges are moving away faster than the close portions of it. And so it's not just that it's expanding, but it's the way it's expanding. Isaiah's writing hundreds of years before Jesus.
They didn't have a
How
telescope.
could they know?
They didn't have a telescope to figure this stuff out.
No.
Isaiah wasn't sitting out behind the temple with a telescope looking out and said, yep, it's expanding. God told him it was, and Isaiah said, okay, you said it, I believe it.
So here's another proof text for the accuracy and the fact that the Bible had to come not from humans. It had to come from outside of time and space.
Right, and the Bible makes exact predictions that are right. You'll hear that a lot from people who don't believe. And, you know, when we're talking to people, that if they're somewhat open and they've had, well, you know, how come so-and-so considers this or that? We can talk to them about that. If they're open, you can have a discussion with them. When I was out on the street, I had people come by that, you know, I talked to them anyway, but I knew from the face it's just a drape over the front. They're not listening to what I say. I would usually ask them if they'd had any sin in their life and where would that go anyway. But there were people that came by that actually were interested in hearing. They wanted to hear, you know, I heard somebody say this, but, you know, what would you say about this particular aspect? And you can talk to them about that, and I believe that does help. I think there are people on a journey like Lee Strobel was, like C.S. Lewis was, like Josh McDowell was. They're on a journey and they're looking. And I think it's important for us to be able to talk to people, not maybe as in depth as all this stuff is, because it gets over, I can't remember all of it either. I spend quite a bit of time before this study goes, so I understand all this stuff and I can repeat it. But there are basic things that we can tell people that are searching, that the Bible is something you can rely on. And maybe people aren't so sure of that right now because they're getting the opposite from most of the voices they hear saying the Bible's outdated. You know, it's against women, which is nonsense. Christianity is the reason why women have the position they have today is because of Christian people that felt that they were all created by God and you can't treat them differently. God said we have different jobs, men and women, but they're not to be treated the way the Greeks and the Romans, and for that matter, even the Jewish people, were treating women. And that's something different that I've heard recently, that Christianity was, you know, confined women and made them lesser than what they really are. But if you look through history, that just is not the case. That's just a lie, flat out lie.
Right.
So anyway, it's 10 minutes past now when we're supposed to leave. Anybody else any questions? Yes, Daniel.
So one last one, I promise this is the
okay.
last one. But I would also mention too that for those who want to claim that man has been around on the earth a lot longer than the biblical chronology would allow, what they're forced to do, and Brian Broderson kind of touched on this on the radio. I was listening to his teaching. He's going through the Gospel of Luke. And it was a whole different way that he approached it. But what the secularist tries to do is they try to say that mortality in earlier generations was very, very different than in our time today. So what you have is you have these very short lifespans, supposedly. And so it's like, you know, like if you look at what secular people will say about humans at the time of the New Testament, they'll say like, oh, you know, the average lifespan was in the 20s at that time. And so what you have is you have like supposedly people would be living very, very short lives. And so you would not have the reproduction that you would expect to see. And part of that, there's two reasons why people claim that. One is to try to elongate how long man has been around. And the other is to try to like primitivize, if that's a word, primitivize the cultures of the past. Do it where it's like, look how primitive it was. People lived such short lives. It was just like a hunter-gatherer existence of hardship. The problem is when you look at either biblical or secular history, it doesn't really bear that out. And I've done some research of what lifespans were like in the past, and what it seems that you have is you do have much higher infant mortality. Infant and childhood mortality was much higher in the past. It's really gone down a lot in recent decades in the last century or two. And that is the progress of modern medicine. That's one area where we can say modern medicine has done wonders. But once you get past that first 10 years of life, it seems that human lifespan has not really increased as much as people want to say that it is. Like, let's say if you look at the average age at death of the founding fathers of our country, the founding fathers lived into their mid 80s to early 90s. Doesn't look that different from today. You look at the sages of ancient Greece, they tended to live into their 80s.
Oh, there you
Yeah.
go.
This sounds like today. It just appears to be that many children, unfortunately, didn't reach adulthood.
And maybe the average age wasn't as old.
Yeah.
Because not as many people had access to the nutrition and things they needed to have.
Statistics, that's what they're using as statistics that lie all the time.
But if
They
you
do,
but if you
regularly,
think about, like, let's
yes.
say John Adams. John Adams was one of our longest lived presidents. He lived into his early 90s. I find John Adams' lifespan more amazing, and speaking of better health and being a better human specimen, than the lifespans today, because let's say Jimmy Carter, who just passed away. He was our longest lived president. He lived to 100. John Adams lived about 8 years less than him. The thing is, Jimmy Carter had access to modern medicine.
Yeah.
John Adams didn't. So for John Adams to be able to live that long without modern medicine, it's like the stronger human specimen was John Adams.
Yeah, it's really more your system, how well it functions.
Because he had to live in good health. That means he was living in good health till the day he died. Reasonably good health. I'm not saying he didn't have some health problems, but he was active till the very end. He had to be able to live at that time.
All right,
All right, brother.
You want to close this
Appreciate
out?
you. I will do so.
Okay.
Father, we just come before you, Lord. We're just in awe of your creation. We think of things like the universe being so distant and so full that no matter where you look in the night sky, we think we see black, and yet there's a galaxy back there somewhere that James Webb is out searching for and continues to find, Lord. And we're awed. You know, the Bible tells us, you tell us in your word that the heavens declare your glory, and we see that, Father. And let us always be in awe of you. Let us always try to bring you glory. Help us to share the wonders of your creation, Father, that you created so much good. Unfortunately, humanity corrupted it at the fall, but Father, help us to continue to seek the good. Help us to meditate on what is pure and lovely and righteous, Father. Help us to continue to seek you more and more, and to continue to learn more about your word, about your creation, so that we can share your love with a lost and dying generation. And I just pray these things in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Amen.